Well, strategy is, in essence, the highest level means to an end.
Yeah.
So is it okay if I have coffee?
Oh, of course.
Cool.
Yes.
All right. What do you want to say in this intro?
Uh,
One more time. One more time. Strategy is the highest what?
It's the highest level means to an end.
Bring the energy.
oh, we're recording. Good people, welcome to Beautiful Questions with Tuli Alma.
Welcome. Yeah. Oops, I ruined the Tuli and Alma part. Okay, one more time.
It's perfect. We appreciate you joining us here for another really, really wonderful conversation that we had with Dr. BK Simerson. So Alma, tell us a little bit about BK. Who is he? How do we know him?
So we first met BK as an instructor in a course called Leading with Strategic Thinking. And I really went into, personally, I went into this class like, okay, strategy. Yeah, those are things that I've got to understand, et cetera, et cetera. But as you'll see, dear listeners and viewers, BK is a very special human being. He's so unique. He'll share a little bit of his professional trajectory. And as we were in that class, being able to kind of hear his stories and then have outside conversations with him, you realize like, wow, what a brilliant mind. He is currently a consultant. He's a strategy consultant, and he does a little bit of leadership development and organizational development. He is also an author and a graduate level instructor. And
Yeah.
what else am I missing?
Yeah, I mean, and he's got a doctorate and all that, and the breadth of his experience is just amazing. He's worked with pretty much any kind of organization, government, non-government, and he just brings wisdom, experience, education, rigor, strategic thinking, for lack of a better term, to what he does, what he teaches.
Yeah. And yet humility. So there's a cool thing that he shares at the end. I won't spoil it, but I think listeners, what you can really like, I had to get my notebook out, kind of like scurry to write down a few things because because we go into these conversations really having a general idea, but really not knowing what kind of gems are going to be shared. So I appreciate it. He gives us a really great definition of what strategic thinking is, what strategic leadership is. He also shares some really good practical tips on like how you can be more strategic wherever you are in your organization right now. So be listening out for those things and a few anecdotes and a few great one-liners. Oh my goodness. There's some good ones.
Amazing. Well, a lot to look forward to, and thank you all for joining us for this conversation with Dr. BK Simerson. All right, Alma. Well, I'm ready when you are.
All right. Well, BK, thank you so much for joining us today. Tuli and I have been in especially one class that stands out, right? Leading with Strategic Thinking, a really awesome class we had with you. That's where I first at least got to know you. And I remember having a few really good conversations with you about how important like having a strategic mindset is. I'm sure Tuli can share some others. But before we get to all of that, because that was just last year, BK, could you share with us and with our audience a little bit about your own professional journey? How did you get to where you are and where are you?
Oh, gosh. Well, you can look at me and tell that I'm slightly beyond mid-career.
Really?
My career actually started in law enforcement. So I was a street cop for several years. But while I was a street cop working rotating shifts, I went to school. And I worked on my undergraduate. I received a master's and eventually received a doctorate. But as I was studying from the academic side, I was focusing more and more on either human resource development, organization development, or strategic thinking and strategic planning. And so when I received my graduate degree, it was in management and organizational development. So that's on the academic side.
Yeah.
About when I was concluding my academic studies, I decided to leave law enforcement and enter into healthcare because that's a somewhat uneasy transition. because both are public service, both are helping professions, and a lot of the knowledge, skills, and techniques that you learn in law enforcement can be applied to healthcare. But from healthcare, I went into petrochemical, so that was my practitioner side. But then after the petrochemical, I started working for various management consultancies, and I spent time in 4 of the leading management consulting firms. So I've got practical experience as well as consulting experience.
Wow. So wait, if we go back to healthcare, when you transitioned over to healthcare, what type of role were you in?
I entered, it was North Carolina Baptist Hospitals, and I entered a position which was Director of Training and Organization Development.
Oh, so wow. So how involved did you get into like designing, instructional design of learning experiences or facilitating even?
You know, I did not have much hands-on experience there. When I was with the Department of Justice, I developed a 6-week management development program, and then I developed a 1-week program for newly appointed police chiefs.
Wow.
And so that's where I got my curriculum design, going through the needs assessment, designing, developing, conducting, evaluating, etc. But that was in the Department of Justice. When I was at North Carolina Baptist Hospital, I spent most of my time working closely with the management group in terms of helping create visions, missions, strategic plans. And they had a management engineering group, which was in essence a management analysis and solution group. And so we worked closely with them on different fronts.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Can we go back for a moment to your time in law enforcement? Because I'm really fascinated by that, and I just have a 2-part question. Like, first of all, what made you do that? What made you go and become a police officer, become a cop? And the second part of my question is, I'm curious if there are lessons you learned there that you still kind of use or think about.
You know, excellent question, both questions. I came from a family of police officers, not in my immediate family, but I had several cousins and uncles who were either police officers or sheriff's deputies. And so as I was growing up, I kind of leaned in that direction. When I was in the 9th grade, I had a teacher that was very interested in my future. So she arranged for me to meet with the police chief at that time. He recommended me doing certain things in terms of my academic studies. And so from the 9th grade on, I kind of positioned to become a police officer. So that was my aspiration, and that's what I did in terms of academic development. In terms of lessons learned, it's interesting. When you're a police officer, you very quickly, if you're a good police officer, you very quickly learn to monitor and assess individual behavior as well as different situations and circumstances. You also learn that it's absolutely critical that you monitor and manage your own personal emotions and behavior. And so those are, several things that I brought with me from law enforcement. Another thing is that in law enforcement, again, if you are an effective officer, you learn to very effectively manage disagreement and conflict. And so when I work with teams and when I work with organizations, a lot of times I have to apply those observation skills. I have to remain self and situationally aware. And I frequently apply the disagreement management and the conflict management skills.
Yeah. How did they come in handy in the consulting firms that you worked for? Either with clients or internally?
And in the consulting firms that I worked with, I played a dual role. I served internal customers as well as external clients.
Okay.
And interestingly, you have more freedom, you have more autonomy when you're working with those external clients than you do the internal customers. So I was able to apply those kind of skills more often when I was working with external clients.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It occurs to me that, you know, you start your career doing something that is very like you're dealing with individuals very much on a kinds of basis, and you've moved to really looking at systems and organizations and, you know, and much larger you know, like a much larger picture of things, in a sense, like from the micro to the macro. It seems that the micro skills that you've learned as a police officer are still helpful when you're doing, so to speak, macro work, strategic work. Do you think about that?
Yes, I do. You know, it's interesting because oftentimes when you're working with a president, a COO, a CEO, it's almost like they forget that the decisions that they're making and the actions that they're taking are influencing and impacting people, impacting individuals. The one thing that drives me up the wall is when someone says, this isn't personal. Don't take it personally. You cannot get more personal than some of the decisions that are made in the C-suite and how they influence and impact not the organization or divisions or departments or teams, but the individuals. So I think the law enforcement helped sensitize me to the importance of, regardless of the nature, regardless of the very nature of the decision you're making, in its most common fundamental element, it is impacting and influencing people. And unfortunately, a lot of the decisions that leaders make impact not only the individual, but the individual's immediate and even extended family. And it can impact them for generations to come. So that's one of the reasons I think that when leaders make decisions, they should be thinking and leading strategically.
Could you tell us, okay, so you did consulting with these 4 companies, and what is life, what are your professional pursuits look like right now? I know we'll get to some of your books that you've written, and we've already mentioned that you give at least one class, you teach at least one class, maybe more, not sure. But what has your attention right now? What are you into? What are you pursuing professionally and if you want personally?
So I own a small practice.
Okay.
It's primarily a solo endeavor, although I do try to keep 2 people fairly busy.
Okay.
But we focus on strategic planning, leadership development, and change management. But I would say that 80% of our work is around strategy formulation and execution. But my small practice, I've been fortunate enough to work with corporations across 19 different industries. I've had an opportunity to work with every branch of the U.S. military. I've worked with different federal government agencies. I've also worked with federal governments. And so I've had an opportunity to work with a lot of different individuals, a lot of different organizations within a wide variety of contexts, situations, and circumstances. But again, most of the work that I now do centers around strategy formulation and execution versus the leadership and the change. Now, it's interesting. Oftentimes, I'll work with an organization, and when they go through their strategic planning, they see that the strategic planning is going to drive significant organizational change and transition. So I will work with them on that front, but it kind of flows out of the strategic planning. And the same is the case with leadership development. Oftentimes, the results of the strategic plan suggest that additional strategic leadership competencies and capabilities need to be developed. So I will help organizations develop accelerated leadership development programs.
That's great. And before we get deeper into strategy and strategic thinking, which we really want to ask you about, I'm just curious if you'll indulge me a little bit, because I'm kind of getting started on a project, and how does one get to have all these to pick up all these interesting clients? You know, different branches of the military, companies. How do you do that?
All of my growth has been through word of mouth. So I work with a client, and I typically do not formally ask them, but they typically will share my name with others, either in adjacent organizations or adjacent industries.
Yeah.
And that's how I've grown. So I literally started with one client, and it's kind of mushroomed and grown from there. It's interesting. My brother, he asked me, so tell me your secret sauce. Mm-hmm. And I tell him, well, I really don't have any secret sauce other than that when you're working with your client to do all that you can do. And I know this is probably lost its meaning over time, but move mountains if necessary, to not only meet, but to exceed the needs, expectations, and requirements of your client. Because if you can meet or exceed their needs and expectations, then you can assume that they're going to share your name with others. And here's another thing that's kind of a secondary benefit. Mm-hmm. Because I've worked with the organizations that I've worked with, and every organization I've worked with is willing to share my name with others. Most of the time, I do not need to share references because I find oftentimes that the referencing process is, in essence, a waste of everybody's time, including the ones receiving the telephone call. But that's the story of my growth.
Amazing. Yeah. I mean, it sounds like the answer is the story of the growth is do good work.
Yeah. Well, but for example, when you work with the federal government,
yeah,
when you work with the federal government and you are leading either strategic, regional, or tactical planning sessions, there are more individuals in the room than's just in that particular agency or organization. So if you're creating a strategic plan or a regional plan for the U.S. government, there are other governmental agencies in attendance, and there are typically other branches of the military in attendance. So they see you in action. They see how you respond to either situations or challenges that surface. And if they are impressed, then when they are facing the same challenge or opportunity, they'll give you a call.
Yeah.
But that's just the nature of governmental strategic planning.
And that's really interesting. Would you say, is there a fundamental difference between working on a government project and working in like private industry? Or...
Yes, there. But I will say this: with any organization which you work, you have to very quickly determine their style, their approach, their practices, and their culture, because you have to meet the client with wherever they currently stand. Mm-hmm. So I consider every client to be different. And so when I first have the initial conversations, I try to figure out where they're coming from strategically. I try to get a sense for their sense of urgency, for their sense of magnitude. I try to get a sense for their tempo, their cadence, and I try to bring all of that together in creating either a recommendation or a proposal, because I want to be in lockstep with them, not ask them or expect them or try to force them to be in lockstep with me.
Yeah, makes sense.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I'm curious about, strategy. It's come up a lot. We've said it, I don't know how many times. Strategic thinking. There was a phrase you said a little while ago I think you said something to the effect of, and that's why every leader needs to learn about strategic thinking,
or to think strategically, maybe.
To think strategically.
Yeah.
It was something like that. Okay, so there's some passion here, and I'm interested. Both of us really were interested in what has made you passionate about strategic thinking. But before you even get to like why it lights you up so much and why you're so convinced that it's a necessary skill, how would you define it? And then why is it necessary?
Well, strategy is, in essence, the highest level means to an end.
One more time. Strategy is the highest what?
It's the highest level means to an end.
Okay.
So you don't have to have a particular position. You don't have to hold a particular title. You don't have to be considered one of them. You don't have to be considered one of those smart people. If you have a goal, if you have an objective, if you have an intent that you really care about and are serious about, then you want to make sure that the means that you apply that will bring you closer to that goal or that objective or that imperative, you want to make sure that they are the right means, that they're being applied at the right time, in the right sequence, in the right way, using the right resources. And so when you start trying to be as right as you can be, that's when you're thinking and leading strategically.
So you
go ahead.
No, let me let you finish. I'm sorry. Yeah.
I've been fortunate because I'm coming up on 14 years teaching in MSLOC.
Wow.
The Leading with Strategic Thinking course. So for, in essence, more than 14 years, I have devoted a lot of time and put forth a lot of effort having conversations with individuals, reading as much as I can and learning as much as I can about strategy, strategic thinking, strategic leadership, strategy formulation, and strategy execution. So I have developed, in at least in my mind, unique, discrete definitions for each of those terms.
All right, can you walk us through them?
Sure. Yeah, and let me start with by saying that the fundamental question is, why is all this important?
Yeah.
Well,
definitely.
All the research that I've done and all of the leaders that I have interviewed, and for our book, Leading with Strategic Thinking, we interviewed more than 300 leaders from around the world. And those interviews primarily led us to conclude that leadership without strategic thinking will inevitably lack optimal focus. And that strategic thinking without leadership will inevitably lack optimal results and outcomes. So thinking and leadership are both important. Strategic thinking and strategic leadership are both important. Now, when I think of strategic thinking, I think of individuals who are exhibiting three characteristics. With a strategic thinker, that person is being thorough and thoughtful in terms of their analysis and their consideration. And it's interesting, a lot of times individuals feel that, well, in order for me to be a strategic thinker, I've got to be the one with all the ideas. I've got to be the one with all the suggestions and recommendations. Whereas when I think of a person being thoughtful and thorough, that is a person asking the right questions. That's the person asking the questions to broaden their understanding and deepen their understanding about either an individual, an event, a situation, or a circumstance.
Right.
So a strategic thinker is thorough and they're thoughtful. They're also intentional. And if you think about a person who's strategic, it's a person who is not easily distracted. They're individuals who even though they're being pushed and pulled in a lot of different directions, they do not allow that to disrupt their thinking, their analysis, and their consideration. So strategic thinking and strategic thinkers are very intentional.
Yeah.
And then finally, strategic thinkers are also self and situationally aware. And we have to keep in mind that we as individuals, at least I hope, at least I assume, that we're continuously growing and developing and learning. So we're not the same person tomorrow as we are today. Well, the situations are the same way. They're constantly evolving and changing.
Yeah.
So strategic thinkers are aware of that, and they try to keep up with things in terms of understanding the baseline as well as understanding the evolving nature of their being self-aware and being situationally aware. So that's the strategic thinker.
Yeah.
The strategic leader also exhibits three behaviors. The strategic leader, they focus on and respond to patterns and trends. And when it comes to those patterns and trends, it's not just wishful thinking, it's not just opinions, but it has to do with evidence and data, fact. Yeah. Also, strategic leaders, they not only strive to make valid decisions, but they strive to make credible decisions. What's the difference? A person who strives to make a valid decision is a person that's wanting to make a decision that will allow them to achieve their stated goal. A person who strives to make a credible decision is a person who tries to make a decision that's going to make sense to the slate of stakeholders that are in that person's either life stream or work stream.
Yeah.
And then finally, strategic leaders, they are all about managing risk. So they assess it to determine how much risk exists, and then they try to do things to either avoid it, reduce it, negate it, or mitigate it.
Right.
And so that's what makes, from our research and our interviews, that's what makes for a strategic leader.
Wow.
I have so many questions.
I know.
But you first, Alma.
You sure?
No,
okay.
I'm not sure.
No.
I'm happy to go, but yeah, go ahead.
Well, let's maybe let's start here. Yeah, this is so interesting. Okay. I'd love a story, but
an example, yeah.
Of course, an example. Yeah, like a moment. I don't know if there was like an aha moment perhaps in your life when you encountered someone, right? Maybe a client or someone, and you realized how important strategic thinking was, either because they were doing it or they weren't, and you could see how valuable it would have been. Could you? Let's start there. I'll do a simple ask.
Could I give you two stories?
Please.
We'd love to.
And I promise they'll be quick.
Oh, okay. Take your time.
we got time.
So we live out in the west suburbs, and there is a medical center here that is highly recognized. I mean, it is well known through not only the region, but outside of the region. And they have a really top-notch emergency department. And they have a really top-notch director who heads the emergency department. The director noticed that her patient satisfaction scores were plummeting. And so the director said, what can we do as individuals and what can we do as a department to turn that so that the satisfaction begins to increase? So they originally decided, I know what we'll do. Whenever we have patients and patient family members who come in, and if they're here more than a half hour, we're going to start handing out bottles of water. Well, they did that. They saw a short-term increase, but then it started. So they decided, well, why don't we do this? when we have patients and patient family members who come into the waiting room and they have to be in the waiting room for more than 3 or 4 hours, why don't we start handing out a blanket? Because the room's kind of cold. So they started doing that. They saw a slight increase, but then it started decreasing. So they continued brainstorming, and they said, well, why don't we do this? If they are in the waiting room over X number of hours, and the hours includes either a breakfast time, lunch time, or dinner time, why don't we serve them breakfast, lunch, or dinner? They did that. So they started seeing an increase, but then a decrease.
Okay.
The question becomes, if that, and again, I'm not being critical, but just give this some thought. If that director of the emergency department, instead of saying, what can we do to placate and try to increase the satisfaction level of individuals who are stuck in the emergency room or the emergency department over time, instead of asking that question, what if her question would have been, how can we change our emergency department systems and processes in a way that the patients and the patients' families are funneled through our department quicker so that they enter quickly, they go through quickly, and they exit quickly?
Yeah.
What might their research have shown? So from my perspective, that is a good example of someone failing to have that strategic perspective. The more strategic perspective would have been, how can we address, how can we solve, how can we mitigate the root cause versus how can we start trying to placate or address these symptoms. That's one example. Another example is the USA, the YMCA of the USA. They are in essence a federation. They are the leaders of a federation of local and regional Ys across and beyond the USA. Whenever the YMCA of the USA creates a strategic plan, the leaders of all the local and regional Ys, they can review it and they can accept it, they can modify it, or they can reject it. They are not required to take that and act upon it. So the head of the YMCA of the USA determined many years ago that our having a strategic plan is not our objective. It's not our goal. Our goal is to come up with good ideas that will be adopted and implemented throughout all of our regional and local Ys. So the question became not how can we create a strategic plan, but the question became how can we involve enough people from around the United States from throughout our entire system so that the resulting plan would be understood by and would have a core group throughout the system who commit to, are likely to contribute to, and become advocates of the resulting strategic plan. So from my perspective, that individual took a very strategic perspective. The objective was not to create the strategic plan. The objective was to create a plan that led to action that would be taken throughout the entire system.
Yeah.
So that's two examples, and I think they're pretty good examples of a person having, a tactical versus a more strategic perspective.
Yeah, that's great. One thing that I'm curious about is it seems to me that sometimes people can get a little bit caught up in thinking and not acting.
Mm-hmm.
And when I say people, I'm thinking of myself here, where I could be paralyzed by by planning and really wanting to be strategic. And I've actually, in the last couple of years, this is especially, through graduate school and things that I've learned about being agile and, concepts like design thinking. I've tried very hard to kind of, learn also through action. And I'm curious how you think about balancing those two things. On the one hand, taking action, on the other hand, making sure that you're being strategic.
I said several minutes ago that whenever I begin working with a new organization, I learn as much about them as I can because I try to meet them wherever they are.
Yeah.
My experience suggests that when you're working with a management team or an executive team, that team takes on a particular personality, a particular personal style. And what I've discovered is that most of the teams that you work with are either, and I'm going to use psychological terms, I'm not a psychologist, but say from a Myers-Briggs type indicator perspective, most of the teams I work with are either introverted or extroverted. I have seen teams that have decisions that have to be made, that plans that need to be constructed, and actions that need to be taken because they are in a very volatile situation, that the environment is very threatening. I've worked with introverted teams that never established that sense of urgency. And so they are very comfortable having conversations, having discussions. They're comfortable drawing conclusions and making decisions and putting them all in a nice notebook and putting them up on the desk or on the shelf and not take the necessary action.
Yeah.
I'm going to be candid here. What I just described, probably in my business, in my experience, occurs probably less than 5% of the time. 95% of the time, I work with leadership and management teams where they're so extroverted, they will have an agenda and they have someone that's basically checking off the agenda, and they are wanting to stay within the time frames, and they're wanting to draw a conclusion or make a decision and then get on with it. It scares me because I work with teams that will make a 10 or 20 or $30 million decision after having about 5 minutes of conversation. So my main concern working with teams is that, are they having enough discussion? Are they analyzing this to the extent that they should be analyzing? Could they defend this if a third party challenged it? If a regulator questioned it, could they answer that? What can I do to slow them down so that they do not prematurely draw conclusions and make decisions? Now, when I work with either the introverted or extroverted team, I manage that challenge rather mechanically. I believe in the use of management tools and techniques, and I believe in the use of management and planning tools and techniques. And so with the introverted team, if you construct the action plan, and if you assign owners and sponsors, and if you build incentives and controls in, they will take the necessary action. And with the extroverted team, if you create and post decision criteria and a decision-making process, that will give them the tempo and cadence they need to have the needed conversation, to conduct the needed analysis, to draw the valid and credible conclusions, and make the credible and valid decisions. So I do it rather mechanically.
Wow.
I have literally left strategic planning sessions where I was able to go to my room, which was just down the hall, and I have been able to literally wring water out of my jacket. And the reason for that is the meeting can be so intense and it can be so exhausting because I'm trying to energize the introverted group and I'm trying to slow down the extroverted group. It is literally physically demanding on my front.
Yeah. That's interesting to your question, because the first story about the clinic or the hospital, right?
Yeah.
The hospital. I was also thinking about, like, okay, that one resonates with me the most because of what I have seen working also as a consultant and working on a few teams. I would say that perhaps Western culture, like, it's a little more normal and kind of corporate culture to go, like, to be quote unquote practical. Like, there's a problem, fix it. Hey, I mean, you hear these types of phrases like, if you see something, don't come to me with a problem, come to me with some solutions. And there's this idea of like, oh, I can imagine that leader, right? Like, we got low results on whatever the satisfaction and and so the problem, let's figure out the problem is probably this. And then we sat around and we thought and we brainstormed. So it actually is, even though it's a healthcare one, it's so similar to things that I have been in where I'm like, wait. This is what made me think of kind of design justice and design thinking, and a mentality of like, are you even asking the right question? And you said before, like, questions, and this podcast, right, is about questions. So I wonder, we think part of that. So I wonder if, like, what you haven't said it explicitly, because you said a strategic thinker is thorough, intentional, thoughtful, also has, a degree of self-awareness. I took notes. That was not from memory. I did take notes. So if a leader is thoughtful, thorough, and intentional, what role do questions play within strategic thinking? What do you think? And especially maybe using that first story as.
And can I add a component to your wonderful question? I would also love some examples of questions that you like to ask when you're in a planning session or when you meet with a leader.
Ooh. That might be your secret sauce.
We'll have to discuss that on a different day. No. So the first question about the types of questions, most individuals ask one of two types of questions. Most individuals ask a question that will broaden their understanding. Others ask questions that are likely to deepen their understanding. And it's interesting. I have taken teams of individuals and given them business cases involving airline incidents, and have them work through the process and ask them to note the questions that they ask, trying to come to a conclusion, trying to make a decision. And experience suggests one of two types of questions: broadening and deepening. So if you're the broadening type team, you're looking at, say, an internal factor or an internal situation. And you're asking, okay, in terms of the internal variables, what is influencing and impacting this either challenge or opportunity? And they look at things like strategy, structure, systems and processes, technology, the human capability and capacity, and the culture. They consider things like that, and they will literally brainstorm, trying to broaden the factors that they're taking into consideration. Now, where they fall short is on two fronts. One, they typically are very broad in their thinking, but in being broad in their thinking, they're not given the depth of analysis that needs to be applied. Also, individual teams that are broad in their thinking, my experience suggests that they're great at the brainstorming, but when it comes to the synthesis, they fall short. So those types of teams, those types of organizations, you have to give them a technique or a process that will help them, one, take that multitude, that great list of brainstormed ideas and bring it to something that's useful. So with that, I recommend the affinity diagram, and I recommend the interrelationship digraph. So again, I fall back on tools and techniques to have individuals who ask those types of questions to become more effective. In terms of that broad group, to help them start drilling down on one or more of those issues, I recommend the 5 whys. You know, the 5 whys, it's not rocket science. It's not that difficult, but it will let you, in a very planned and purposeful way, go through just the characteristics, and then help you work through the symptoms, and then will help you eventually get to the root, either the root issue or the root cause. So, and I respond to that fairly mechanically. The other team is the team that's very deep in their thinking. And so they will ask the what questions and they will ask the why questions, but they will look at it from a very narrow perspective. If it's an event, they will look at the event, but they don't think about the surrounding situation, the surrounding conditions, the surrounding factors. They don't think of the enabling factors and the driving factors that may have led to that event. And so they're looking at it very narrowly. So they have to broaden their perspective. And what I say there is that they need to use a tool such as the fishbone so that it will drive their thinking into the other variables, the other factors and forces that probably contributed to that single event. The challenge when working with teams that are like I just described, they focus on events. Well, whenever you're working with a team and you're trying to formulate or execute strategy, you do not focus on the event. You focus on patterns. And so you have to bring them up and ask them, so what other similar events have occurred, or what other events have occurred that we can diagnose and diagnose properly?
That's great. So if
I hope that you can tell I love this stuff. It is so interesting to me, and it is so compelling to me, because if you think about strategy, strategic thinking, and strategic leadership, it falls at the intersection of cognitive psychology, systems thinking, and game theory. And so when you think about something as simple as what are the kinds of questions people ask, and how do they perceive either the event, situation, or circumstance, just that is drawing upon cognitive psychology, systems thinking, and game theory. I mean, it's to me compelling.
Absolutely. I mean, it occurs to me that, let's say I was someone and I worked in an organization and I had a hard time with strategic thinking, or I felt my team did, or we were struggling. And so obviously if I could afford you, I'd hire you. However, what I'm curious about is, in your experience, can people really be trained to become strategic thinkers?
Yes.
And how?
How?
Well, my initial thought is, when you think about initial thinkers as being thorough and thoughtful, give some thought as to, so what does that mean to you? What does it suggest? What does it imply? When you're being thoughtful and thorough, what are you doing? What are you asking? Do you use tools? if you're wanting to be thorough, do you use a checklist, or do you have certain questions that you ask? Oh, by the way, the question that I almost always ask, when it comes to strategy formulation, is, so is this a period of threat or opportunity?
Okay.
And that will give you guidance as to several things. If an organization, if a team considers themselves to be facing threatening situation, they are going to be much more focused. They're not going to be willing to discuss as they typically would. They're not going to wish to consider as many options or alternate paths as they normally would. They're going to want to compress their analysis and decision making, and they will want to make the decision and then get on with the next item as quickly as possible. That is if they perceive it to be a threat. If they see it as an opportunity, they're actually going to be more open. They're going to be more relaxed. They're going to invite more discussion and conversation. They are going to invite more opposing viewpoints. They are going to not compress, but they're going to flex and expand the amount of conversation and discussion. They are not going to prematurely drive to a conclusion or decision. And once they finish, once they make that call, someone will invariably say, well, let's go back and discuss this element, this facet, this aspect of what we just finished talking, which the other group would never consider doing. So that's one question I always ask. Is this an opportunity or is this a threat? I'll also ask, so from your perspective, what is the ideal state? What is the ideal future? Because when you, and I typically ask the entire team that, and I ask them to write it down and then share it with each other after everyone's written it down. Because when you know the end state, then I kind of begin with the end in mind. And you will discover that if they have a particular endpoint in mind, then it's going to be very difficult to get you away from that trajectory as they're analyzing and drawing conclusions, and then drawing conclusions and making decisions. So those are two things that I always ask. Now, when it's at the front end of the conversation or my working with someone, I always ask the sponsor or the owner or my client what optimal success will look like in terms of my contribution. And it's interesting. That is when you learn whether someone really wants you to be there as a thought leader, whether they want you to be there as a facilitator, or whether they want you to be there as simply an extra set of hands. That's when you have to decide what your value proposition is and whether it matches their need, their expectation. So those are the three questions I ask.
Oh, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, that's like really good consulting advice. Anyone who has, whether an internal or external consulting role, like even just within a corporation, you know, and serving an internal customer, like you mentioned that you did a few times, even being able to ask your internal customer, what does success look like in terms of working with me? I think that's incredible, because it's such a great way to manage assumptions and biases and expectations, because if then they have an expectation that's completely out of line, you can work with it right. Well, let's talk about this.
Well, it's interesting because if you're an internal and you're working with a prospective internal customer, and if they say, we just need for you to take notes and we need for you to put things up on the board, I would say do not automatically reject that request, because if you're taking notes, you can ask really good qualifying questions, clarifying questions. And if you're taking notes on the board, you can take notes in a way that will prove thought-provoking to the people sitting around the table. And before you know it, they will be letting you ask questions and make comments. And before you know it, you'll be sitting at the table.
Look at that as an example of strategic thinking. That's funny, BK, because actually tomorrow I have been hired just a little gig to actually just be a note taker. And I honestly have, until you said that, I've just come in like, this is the easiest thing in the world. I'm just going to sit there and take notes. And at the end, I'll kind of clean them up and be like, here's some big things. But I hadn't thought of that framing of actually how much power, in a good way, influence, right, you can have as the person who's listening and asking questions and probing. But that's fascinating.
So this is something for you to consider. And I think that this is like an underlying tenet of mine.
Okay.
An important element of strategic thinking is to be intentional.
Mm-hmm.
Be intentional. And you know, think about your ultimate North Star, your ultimate goal, and always be intentional in terms of heading toward that. And if your North Star is to become an ABC, then if you're asked to take notes, ask yourself, how can I modify? How can I twist? How can I so that my taking notes will put me one step closer to my becoming an ABC. For example, I receive telephone calls from MSLOC students who are about to select their capstone project topic. And when I first start speaking with them, it's my gut feel is that they consider the capstone as just a project. It's just something that they've got to do to get through and get by and get out.
Can I interrupt you just really quickly to clarify for those of our listeners who are not in this master's degree program? The capstone is like a thesis, basically a master's thesis research with a smaller scope, of course, than a PhD.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Continue.
And so I speak to, and I've speak to numerous students who, just by the way they were describing their capstone, and I ask questions to try to get into their reasoning and their logic and their rationale, I realize that they're looking at it not from a strategic perspective. They're not being intentional enough. So what I try to do when I have conversations with these MSLO students is to help them become much more intentional. And I say things like, you know, the capstone project is a project that will give you an opportunity to investigate, to explore, to learn so much about something that baffles you, something that concerns you, something that captivates you, something that compels you. And then I say, you know, the capstone project is a project in and of itself, but it might become a mechanism that will allow you to change our discipline, to change our profession, to change what it means, what it involves, what it entails. And then I tell them, be careful when you select your capstone, because from this day forward, when you hear the issue or the topic raised, you will want to listen in. When you see an article or book that's written about it, you will want to read it. It will become something that will be ingrained into you for the rest of your life. So be intentional when you're selecting your capstone. Be strategic when you select your capstone.
Wow. I mean, unfortunately, Alma, you could have used this advice a few months ago when you were selecting. Now it's a
Now what am
lost.
I gonna do?
Oh well.
Uh,
Okay. You know, hopefully you still find those what are you studying again? The life of
It's
butterflies?
the life of butterflies
oh,
within
Interesting, by the way.
corporate America. I love your face right now, BK. What?
well, no, we have a butterfly. We have a butterfly way station outside.
Oh, look at
Um,
that.
yeah, my wife is a state certified naturalist and a state certified master gardener,
Wow.
and she is really into nature, and so we do have a monarch butterfly way station.
That's
Yeah.
awesome. And yeah, so I actually picked a terrible example because butterflies
Yeah.
are fascinating. So oh well.
Yes.
But think of something boring, and that's what Alma's studying. No,
Yeah,
actually,
right.
Alma's capstone topic is great. Um, do you
Yeah,
want to
So
share?
sure.
so I know that I've been dominating the conversation. Additional questions, ideas, issues that you'd like to discuss, just let me know. Uh, but
Yeah, of course. No, and we tend to do this. We just let it flow anyways. The idea is that you dominate a bit, you know?
Yeah, this is
That's why
kind
we
of by
want to hear
design,
from you.
BK.
Kind of
Yeah,
by
I hope.
design.
I know we're right. We've had a few guests say, I feel like I'm speaking too much, and we're like, no, no, no. That's what we want.
well,
That's the
that's in
whole
essence
idea.
what I was saying.
Yeah, that's the whole idea. That's the whole idea here.
We definitely invited you to speak a bunch because we want to learn from you. But you know what? Maybe I'll share a little bit about what I'm studying and think about the strategic part of it. How about that? And then maybe you can help me. So I'm interested in how individuals on teams make sense of their team identity through narrative, right? So that's like the main piece. Team narratives. What stories do people have about who their team is, how their team behaves, how their team approaches things, those types of big picture narratives, those team narratives. And then if there is a relationship with teams developing efficacy on the collective level, efficacy just in the sense of like we work well together, we overcome challenges, we have a sense of, you know, agency, we can do things together. So the way I did it was not exactly the way I would have wanted to because the scope is so small, but I talked to 11 people on the range of how much collective efficacy they think their team has. So how well they think their team works together. So I had people who were like, no, our team is terrible. And I had people who think that their team is wonderful. And then I asked them quite literally for stories. So instead of just taking it at face value, I asked for, you know, tell me about a time when your team faced a challenge and how did that go and what happened? Tell me about a time that you felt connected to your team, that you felt disconnected, and etc. About 8 stories and a few associations with some narrative elements. And so I'm in the middle of data analysis right now, but basically when I thought about my end goal, so had you been my consultant, BK, you're like, but why do you want to do this? Like, what is success for you? Well, success for me with this particular project is that perhaps some people who listen in on the presentation or read the final article, right, would have a little light bulb go on and say, you know what, I really should be paying attention to how people on my team, if supposing they're a leader, how people on my team are, you know, narrating and how they are making sense of the things that happen on our team. Because the narratives are there and the sense making is always happening. There is no button to make human beings stop sense making, right? As long as they're alive and have full cognitive functions. So sense making is happening and people are telling stories to themselves and then telling stories collectively. So my big thesis is like, leaders, we've got to pay attention to this because this affects how people feel, right, are engaged within a team, And you do have some power, and you can ask questions, and you can surface some of those narratives and to see whether those narratives are helpful or not helpful in pursuit of whatever it is you're trying to achieve. So, thoughts? You've got. I love the look on your face right now.
There's well, two things.
Yeah.
At the front end, when you were kind of creating the parameters, my immediate thought is that there are different types of teams that are charged to do different types of things.
Totally.
Most of the teams that I work with and that I'm around that kind of cross my workflow are teams that are into the single loop learning.
What do you mean by that, single loop?
Single loop. Are you familiar with the single loop and double loop learning?
Maybe.
It has to do with systems thinking.
Okay.
The single loop is that you are charged to address or solve an issue.
Okay.
Work a problem. But if you're single loop, you're basically given parameters that you have to assume that all the major systems and business processes will remain the same, that you will not be in a position to comment on or modify the fundamental elements of our work or our business. You are constrained in terms of your consideration, and you're constrained in terms of the breadth and depth of your deliverable, whether it's a suggested recommendation or suggestion. If it's double loop, you're in essence told, this is a challenge, this is a problem, have at it. And if we need to modify our technology, if we need to modify our systems, if we need to modify our business processes, if we need to do whatever, it's all open. It's all free game. You are not constrained in terms of your analysis, your consideration, or your deliverable. Your suggestion or recommendation can be as broad or as deep as it needs to be. So what I'm thinking is it would be interesting to find out if the narrative is different according to whether and let's not use double loop or single loop. Let's say it'd be interesting to see if the narrative is different according to the nature of the team. And then it would be interesting to see if the narrative influences the success of the team, even maybe progress if you could standardize that. But how does the narrative impact or influence the overall success? So that's one thought. But that has to do with your design. The bigger thought is when you said the final article.
Yeah.
I would encourage you not to consider your deliverable for MSLOC to be your final article. The question comes, how can you use your capstone to open the door to the broader audience? How might you take your write-up for MSLOC and target a journal that accepts unsolicited manuscripts? Or how might you get to know someone in an organization so that they learn about you and they ask you to submit a manuscript?
Yeah.
See it as broader and more strategic in terms of this being a deliverable for MSLOC. You don't know where it might take you. You might, who knows where it might lead.
Fantastic. Oh, thank you. Thank you for asking the question, Tuli.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, BK.
I'm curious, if we can take a lot of these ideas that we've been talking about when it comes to strategy, strategic thinking, strategic leadership, and maybe talk about something that's very current. So, recently, a terrible natural disaster in southeastern Turkey and Syria. And I'm curious, I'll leave it up to you if you want to talk about the search and rescue effort or the recovery effort or whatever it might be. How might one think about this in a strategic way?
So, it's interesting. A lot of individuals, I would say, either over the internet or on their home television set, watching the news, they're seeing search and rescue efforts underway. And what they focus on is that person or animal that is entering the zone to search and rescue. And they kind of leave it there. But what I think about 10 or 15 steps removed from there, the infrastructure that had to have been put in place so that search and rescue team even exists. And then think about all the planning and prep and money, all the resources that went into equipping that team. And then think about all the prep and planning that went into training those individuals so that when they were called, they were properly prepared in terms of their competency and capability. So I automatically think of all that. Again, 10 or 15 steps removed from their actually going through the zone. And then I start thinking about, you have 10 or 12 individuals, however many are in that unit. I saw a group that came in from Japan. So if you think about all the variables that had to fall into place and had to line up that helped them go from Japan to, say, into Turkey. I mean, they had to have transportation from Japan to Turkey. They had to have a usable runway once they landed in Turkey. I'm assuming that the zone that they're searching is not right next to the airport, so they had to have transportation from the airport there. Mm-hmm. While they're in the zone, they have to almost have a continuous supply of water. They have to have periodic food. They have to have shelter because they're going to become exhausted and they're going to lose their effectiveness and efficiency if they don't get some rest.
Yeah.
Just think about all the things, all the variables that had to fall into place and line up. And then when it comes to integration and coordination, in terms of integrating all the search and rescue teams, if they are not properly integrated, then you're going to have areas, you're going to have zones that need to be searched that are not being searched. Or you're going to have areas or zones that are being searched by duplicate units. So think about the integration measures that are having to be taken into place. And then think about the coordination. If you've got 10 search and rescue teams at play, they have to be properly coordinated. Otherwise, they may be going to areas and zones where survivors are the least likely, or individuals who are in distress are least likely to exist. And there will be other areas and other zones where individuals will be under the most distress and are most likely to exist that are being ignored, therefore loss of life. So I just think in terms of all the variables, in terms of the factors and forces that have to be lined up or put in place in order for them to achieve optimal success. It's mind-boggling.
Mm. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, it really is. It seems to me that it is vital that governments act in strategic ways, just based on everything that you're describing and saying, the amount of kind of the coordination that has to happen in order for a society or a city to function properly. And I'm curious, like, I'm just curious, like, what can governments do to be more strategic, to think more strategically, to act more strategically?
I feel like there's a lot of decisions being made that impact a lot of people almost on a daily basis that are not being made strategically.
Mm.
And I'm afraid that there are decisions that are being made that are based on either personal feelings, personal opinions, or discrete, unique data points, not truly patterns or trends, but discrete, unique data points. And when you make decisions based on feelings or opinions or discrete data points, then they're going to be suboptimal. I mean, they're going to be suboptimal. Also, I think that governments, yes, we have to look at the world realistically, and there are a lot of challenges and threats out there, but we do need to look at it realistically. And I think that there are a lot of governments out there that automatically assumes that everything in the environment is a threat. And that causes you to take a defensive posture, or in some cases, an offensive posture. And the posture does not match the context, the situation, and the circumstance. And that only leads to problems. I think that there are a lot of governments out there, a lot of leaders out there, that when they make a decision, they do not think about making a credible decision from the perspective of all of their stakeholders, but they're making a decision to satisfy only a small group of their stakeholders. And when that happens, odds are it's not a credible decision. I'm going to give a shout out to World Chicago. World Chicago is an NGO that's headquartered in Chicago, but it is a representative of the U.S. Department of State. So it leads programs, and it leads a leadership program around the world that gives individuals, citizens, the ability in the network to think and act as a diplomat. So the World Chicago is all about citizen diplomacy. And to me, I think that is the future of the world. Because when you have citizens who can think and act as diplomats, you're going to be removing some of the negatives that are associated with governments. Because if you have citizen diplomats who have the capabilities, the competencies, the relationships, the networks to act, action will be taken. Appropriate action will be taken.
Yeah.
Those are some thoughts on that.
Yeah. And I appreciate that, because I mean, I was thinking about this, and we don't have to get into this, but the whole, like, the balloon, the Chinese balloon, that was discovered over the US, and I was thinking about this the other day, how, like, the wants of two governments that are maybe in competition with one another, and then the wants of the citizens of that country, to me, don't seem to align. Like, as a citizen of the United States, I mean, I obviously I could only speak for myself. I have no interest in it. I actually have interest in just all people, whether they are Chinese or from wherever they are from, thriving and doing great. There's no interest in my mind that maybe I could be competitive, just like I'm competitive with someone in business, but nothing beyond that. But it seems that when it comes to the government, there's much more. And again, maybe there's, I'm sure there are good reasons for that. But I think, to your point, there's real value to what citizen diplomacy can do.
Yes.
I think about this with the Israelis, Palestinians all the time. Anyway, sorry. Yeah.
So, just as an FYI, I have been asked to appear on different radio broadcasts for the single purpose of assessing decisions that are being made by either government leaders or business leaders. And I do not participate in those types of discussions. For example, there are a lot of decisions being made by business people.
Mm-hmm.
And if I really truly believe that they have positive intent, then they have a lot of data and evidence, information that I don't have access to. And if I had access to all of that, I might agree with their decision. But because I don't, I might disagree with it, and it may be my disagreement may be on the wrong side of the formula. So I always say, if you can assume positive intent, then at least give them benefit of the doubt to the extent that you can. I do say that a lot of decisions are being made that on one hand, they do appear valid, but on the other hand, they do appear to be or to lack credibility.
Right.
Because one or two of the most important stakeholder groups are being kind of left out when it comes to their needs, their expectations, and their requirements.
Which leads me to a question kind of about your definition of thoughtfulness, being thoughtful, right, and thorough as two of the core components of strategic thinking. And I want to take it back maybe into the business world for a moment, because that's kind of my world. That's my bias. But in the business world, right, we see this go, 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 and lots of leaders just go, go, go mentality. Like you see a problem, just fix it, just write the email, just do the little thing. And also to give, I mean, to be fair, so many people are so busy, right? In the business world, there is, in the US or in Western culture, at least, there is a tendency to overload people with work, which leaves less time for being perhaps thorough and thoughtful, and just like, I saw a problem, I did it. I got an email, I just answered. We saw that the employee engagement reports were terrible, so we started just coming up with solutions, and then we just put all the energy in, and we went like out after output. So in one of our first episodes with Chelsea Watkins, we talked about this difference between output and outcome mentality. And in your first story, your example of the clinic, right? It very much was about outputs that in the end are like a lot of money, and based on not making, not really assessing the situation. So let me see if I can ask a beautiful question. How can a leader within the business world with time constraints, right, and American corporate culture that values doing and executing, sometimes over other things, how can that leader, right, practice thoughtfulness and still be credible and not hold things back? How can that, and what is the role of listening? Sorry, 2 questions. I'm not supposed to do that. Bad interviewing skills.
So here are some thoughts, and they're just off the top. I mean, this is a reaction to your question. We in the United States live in a pragmatic society, and with pragmatism, it is action. It's all about action. Now, the action could be a person rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. That's action. But as you point out, the result and outcome. So I'm from the South. And I've had a lot of people from this area ask me, when we ride around, we see horses with blankets on them. Is that to keep them warm? And I automatically think when they ask that, here's an opportunity to think about and discuss the action, the result, and the outcome. So the action there is putting a blanket on your horse. The result is, because the horse is warm, the hair won't grow out as long. The outcome is, if you're a farmer just barely getting by, you won't have to hire someone to come in and trim your horse's hair.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So always, when I'm working with someone that is in that cycle of action, I always try to point out to them, think in terms of action, result, and outcome. And ask if your outcome is goal-driven or value-driven, because a lot of times you'll see that people are taking a lot of action that will lead to results, but in terms of the outcome, it's in essence either worthless or not valued what it should be, because it's not tied to your goal attainment or your value attainment.
Yeah.
So how can people in that environment, in that world, in that churn, become more strategic? Well, I work with a very successful president and COO in a very successful organization. And in my advice and advisement to him, I recommended that he, whenever he is about to say something that is definitive in terms of, this is what we shall do, this is what we should do, this is what, before saying that, I've recommended he ask 3 questions. And it's interesting, he's been doing that for quite a while now. And he said that his doing that has changed the entire conversation.
Wow.
That it has opened his eyes and his ears up to perspectives, to orientations, to thoughts that he would have never even considered. When I work with a client, I always wear a thick rubber band around my wrist. When I'm working with a client, if I feel myself going down the path of making a premature judgment, a premature assessment, if I feel myself drawing a premature conclusion or on the hinge of making a premature decision, I take that rubber band and I pop my wrist. Because I'm trying to reprogram myself so that I am a little bit less action-oriented and a little bit more open to divergent perspectives and orientations.
Yeah.
So that's how I'm trying to be a little bit more strategic. So from my perspective, being a little bit more strategic is not that time consuming. And it doesn't require, a lot of rocket science or technical expertise. It is just giving yourself permission to take a pause and ask a question that you otherwise would not have asked. Or to give yourself permission to consider an issue or a factor or a topic in a way that you otherwise would not have considered it. And it's interesting. When I have this kind of conversation with executives who are really busy, they will immediately dismiss it. They'll say, I don't have enough time. But if I'm having that conversation with a group of executives, one of them will have some insight and they will say, but if we spend 5 more minutes or 10 more minutes on the front end, we might save hours or days on the back end.
Yeah.
There's typically someone in the room that gets it.
Mm.
That's great.
Fascinating. Yeah.
That's great. We have only a few more minutes left, and I'm wondering if we can maybe ask you a couple more questions, and maybe we'll do this, with like a short answer kind of format, if possible. If not, then we'll do a part 2.
I can tell you've spent time with me.
Oh no, and look,
I will be as brief as possible.
I'll spend as much time as you'll give us, as you'll give me, certainly. So one thing I'd love to, I was going to say putting your strategic thinking cap on, but it seems to me that is permanently affixed to your soul, if I may. No. Oh, okay, fair enough. You're saying you're human like the rest of us.
Yeah.
Okay, fair. But that's encouraging to hear because you've obviously practiced this for so long. You've been studying this. You wrote a book on it. You've been lecturing at the graduate level for almost 15 years on this. You've worked with governments, and you still need the rubber band. That's encouraging for me to hear. Honestly. So yeah, one thing I'd love to get like a quick reaction is just some of the things that are going on today in the business world. Like, for example, we see a lot of like layoffs that are happening in big organizations and stuff like that. And I'm curious, like not talking about a specific company, of course, but like often when you see that kind of thing happening, are these companies being strategic? How do you see that?
See, I don't know. That is a very thought-provoking question. It's interesting because there are executives in one company in a particular industry who are laying off, and they're almost on the opposite end of the spectrum. There are executives in a company in the same industry who are not. And so, what intel does this person have that this person doesn't? Or what intel does this person have that this person doesn't? There needs to be dialogue. There needs to be debate. There needs to be conversation. It's interesting. Now, for example, the return to work issue. There are executives who are saying, I demand that you return to work. Well, at minimum, I'm asking, so is that based on an opinion? Is it based on a fear? Is it based on evidence? Is it based on data? Is it truly being strategic, or is it just someone's opinion that we're not as effective, therefore you need to come back? But then you have that person, but then I'm hearing where large corporate giants are getting rid of their buildings or getting rid of the floor that they leased in a particular building. I heard that one organization that leased a floor in the largest building in the world just released it because they're not going to be asking their people to come back because they see it as a cost-saving measure. So how can it be that one is thinking this? And so here's one factor or variable. It could be that this organization is approaching it from a position of weakness or a position of fear. And this organization is approaching it from a position of strength and opportunity and confidence. And that could be but I don't know. It would be interesting to be able to get into the minds of the decision makers to see what factors and variables they're taking into consideration that's leading to those actions. But there is the optimal solution. And over time, regardless of which side you're on, the truth will come out. And I'm afraid there's going to be winners and there's going to be losers because of decisions that are being made today.
Yeah. I like that framing. Yeah.
I really believe that.
Thank you for that.
Oh yeah.
Alma,
Any other questions you'd like to ask?
Yeah, let's pay. We learned something really great from someone you also know, Miss Frances Poe. A wonderful question. So I'd like to ask this question. What
Good.
have
Our final question? Yeah.
Our final question. Yeah. BK,
Okay.
what have you been curious about lately?
Okay, I will continue to focus on the topic.
You don't have to. You really don't have to. You can go into your personal life. Yeah. Whatever you want.
I could talk about our grandson, but I will
Do it.
from a professional perspective, I have been given a lot of thought about where most of the energy goes in your typical strategic planning effort. It seems to me like, based on my experience and in part on my research, that when people come together, they focus almost primarily on internal factors within their control. And then when they go from there into action, into implementation, they focus primarily on internal variables within their control. Whereas I think that your greatest opportunity and challenge are the forces that reside outside the organization that are going to influence you. And these are forces that you can try to take steps to reduce or avoid or mitigate, but that's it. You don't directly control them. Yeah. So I've been given thought as to how can we shift our perspective and create an approach that would put more emphasis on the external forces while maintaining the current focus on the internal factors. I think that the organizations that do that are going to be the winners. But it's just amazing how little time is devoted to those. I mean, we do the SWOT, and so we think about them, but just think of the actual countermeasures that are put into place. Very seldom. Also, in terms of the process that would allow us to monitor the external forces and trigger us into action, that seldom occurs. And to me, that's the exact opposite of what should be happening. So that's what I've been thinking about.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. I mean, Dr. BK Simerson, we are honored to have had you. We sincerely and deeply appreciate your time, your candidness, your thoughtfulness, your strategic thinking, and thank you so much.
Well, thank you for thinking of me, and thank you for keeping me in mind.
Awesome. I have some great notes. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
BK, do you have time for a couple of more, or?
Yeah, we're scheduled for 4:30, Tuli. We're good.
Well, we can go on, and you can edit, and if you need to work it into an hour, you can throw stuff out and.
Perfect. All right, let's see. I'm going to mostly edit what Alma says, and if anything, I'll edit myself. But
I hope that you can tell I love this stuff.